When I was about 16, my family had a holiday in California to visit relatives. I kinda got friendly with one of the neighborhood kids. His name was Brett, and he was a couple of years older than me. On this particular day, Brett had decided we should hike through the countryside. My parents had no objections, having been assured that Brett knew the area like the back of his hand. We had our sleeping bags and a tent with us. Our plan was to find somewhere in the woods to set up camp for the night, or at least I thought it was. But looking back, I think Brett had other plans all along. As it got towards the evening, we ended up at this place. I don't know how to describe it. It looked kinda like a holiday place and had all these wooden cabins, except that they were all a bit shabby. Not somewhere you'd really want to go on holiday, if you know what I mean. Some of them looked empty, some were boarded up, but there was what sounded like a party going on in one of them. Anyway, it had started to rain, and Brett suggested we find an empty one and sneak in for the night rather than putting up the tent. I should have realized right there something was off because we walked past at least 2 cabins that would have done just fine before he finally settled on one. I could tell he was excited about it. If anything, it looked more dilapidated than the rest. Its yellow and white paint was peeling off, and there was a number 28 next to the front door. Brett yanked on it as hard as he could, but he couldn't get it to move. The windows were all boarded up, so we made our way round to the back. The ground dropped away at the back of the cabin, and there were a couple of what looked like basement rooms that seemed completely separate from the rest of the house. In front of them, leading up to the back door, were rickety wooden stairs. Brett tried this door, and surprisingly it swung open without effort. There was a small porch that led into what was clearly a kitchen. "Let's just dump our stuff in here," and he dropped his backpack onto the kitchen floor. I followed suit and piled my backpack and our tiny tent into a heap with his, and followed him further into the cabin. The kitchen led to a living room on the right, and a tiny passageway on the left with a door in it to the bathroom. At either end of the passageway were 2 more doors. The living room was decorated with an off-white paper covered in tiny flowers with green stems and blue flowers. There were curtains still hanging in the windows in a very 70-ish style orange, and against one of the walls was a sofa. There was certainly an odd smell in the room, and the walls seemed to have sprouted black mold all over them. I shuddered involuntarily. "This is gonna be great for my asthma," I muttered. But Brett had already headed into the bedroom on the left. It was completely empty, and he seemed disappointed. We made our way to the room on the right. Again, it was empty. "I think we should sleep in the living room," he said. "Yeah, if I want to spend the night having asthma attacks," I said sarcastically. "Let's sleep in here. It feels warmer than the rest of the place, and there's no mold." He looked disappointed, but could obviously tell my mind was made up. He shrugged and went and grabbed his sleeping bag. I grabbed mine, and we set up camp in the bedroom. There was a large closet in the room, which I briefly explored, but there was nothing in it but a couple of empty beer cans. Apparently, we weren't the first to have this idea. We chatted for a while and had something to eat and drink. Before I knew it, my eyelids were heavy. Brett's father had dropped us off somewhere called Feather Falls early in the morning, and we'd walked all day. By 10 o'clock, I was dead to the world. I awoke to the sound of a muffled scream coming from the living room. My eyes shot open, but before I could move, I felt a small, cold hand clamp itself over my mouth. That touch froze me to my very core, and my limbs were suddenly like lead. "Shh. Pretend you're asleep. If they know you're awake, they'll kill you," a voice whispered next to me. As my wide eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see a small girl kneeling next to me. She looked around 10 years old, but her pale eyes looked older. I nodded my understanding to her, and slowly she moved her hand away. I glanced at Brett, but he was still sleeping soundly. There was another muffled scream from the living room, and a woman's voice. Then the sound of crying. Then suddenly, I heard voices. It sounded like teenage boys arguing. There was odd pauses in the yelling, as though I was only hearing half the conversation. The girl put her finger to her lips, as if to remind me to be quiet. It sounded like all hell was breaking loose in the living room. There were sickening noises, like the sound of someone bashing steak with a meat hammer. I don't know how long it went on for, but it felt like forever. It was at this point I realized I was holding her small, cold hand. I was grabbing onto this tiny girl as though my life depended on it. Tears slid down her face as she whispered, "It's almost over now. I have to go, but you have to stay here." And there was such sadness in the way she said it. I realized that I was crying too. With that, she got up and walked out the door, and utter silence filled the cabin. I wanted with all of my being to believe it was a dream, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I tried shaking Brett, but I couldn't wake him. He was breathing deeply and seemed to be in a very sound sleep. Suddenly, I had that old familiar feeling of my lungs clamping shut. I realized I'd almost been holding my breath for an hour, and the stress and panic had brought on one of my asthma attacks. I scrambled around the floor and then realized I'd left my backpack in the kitchen, complete with my inhaler. I tried to control my breathing to see if it eased, but it began to get worse, and suddenly I knew I had no choice. If I didn't go and get it, I might end up dead anyway. Comforting myself with the thought that there hadn't been any noises in the cabin for a while, I crept out of my sleeping bag and out of the door towards the kitchen. I felt my way around the walls in the dark, praying I wouldn't make a noise, but the cabin sounded utterly quiet and empty. In the distance, I could still hear the sounds of a party coming from one of the other cabins. I grabbed my inhaler and quickly used it. My lungs began to open, and finally, I could take a proper breath. The smell in there was disgusting. I was satisfied there was no one in the cabin anymore. If there had been, I'm pretty certain they'd have heard me already. I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack and made my way back towards the bedroom. As the light swung over the living room floor, I stopped dead in my tracks. As long as I live, I will never forget that sight. On the floor were 3 bodies. One by the sofa was covered with a blanket, and the other 2 teenage boys were lying on the floor. They had clearly been bludgeoned and stabbed. There was blood everywhere, even up the walls. There was no sign of the little girl though. That's when I lost it. I went plowing into the bedroom. "Brett, wake the hell up." I was just about pulling him out of his sleeping bag. This time he woke up easily. "They're dead. All of them." "What? You actually saw something?" I had no idea what he was talking about, and in that moment, I didn't care. Babbling incoherently and practically dragging him by the arm, I pulled him into the living room. My mouth fell open. There was nothing there. The walls were covered in wood paneling. The flowery wallpaper was gone, and there were no curtains. There was no sofa, and definitely no bodies. Honestly, Brett, I was almost sobbing again. There were bodies, 3 of them, and the rooms all changed. Brett looked at me dubiously. "Someone told you about this place, didn't they?" "Nobody told me anything. I don't know anyone here, do I, dumbass? There were wallpaper and a sofa." I trailed off. "No, there wasn't," he hissed, and I could sense the panic beginning to rise in his voice. This room was empty and there wasn't any wallpaper. I was dumbstruck. Clearly, Brett hadn't seen the room as I had seen it. "I just want to get the hell out of here," and I barged past him into the kitchen. I grabbed my backpack and stumbled down the back stairs in the dark. Brett followed closely behind me. We half ran and half stumbled to the cabin where the sounds of partying were coming from and banged on the door. A very drunk, very pretty girl answered it, and we asked if we could use the phone. She took one look at our pale faces and gave a low whistle. "You been in cabin 28, ain't ya?" We nodded dumbly. I called my dad, and within the hour we were in the car heading home. I could feel the anger coming from the driver's seat on the journey home. My dad wasn't exactly pleased with being disrupted in the early hours. Brett and I spoke very little in the car. I did mention to him how hard it had been to wake him up, and he looked at me with these tortured eyes. I could hear you, but I couldn't wake up. I was dreaming I was trapped under the floorboards in a little wooden house. It's the most terrifying dream I've ever had in my life. And he shuddered. I never saw him again after that night. The next day I was sick, and by the time I was feeling better, it was time to go back home. At the time this took place, I had no internet, so the memories of that night were unexplained for a long time. Brett never told me where we'd gone, but I've always felt our visit there was no accident. I think he wanted to check it out, and, in me, found someone completely ignorant of the history of that place. Recently, however, I checked out Cabin 28 online. I read about the gruesome murder of a woman and her son and his friend, and the disappearance of her 12-year-old daughter, whose bones were later found near Feather Falls. I read about the children that slept through the whole thing in the bedroom Brett and I occupied that night. What really got to me, though, was a crime scene photo I came across of the wall in the cabin. A photo of pale walls with a small floral pattern of green stems and blue flowers. My friend Lily has a cabin on a lake in Washington, and one summer she brought me and her cousin Evan. It had been a great couple of days, and on the last night, like we had the past few nights, we went fishing at the lake. About a 5-minute walk from her cabin. It was about 7 p.m. and the fishing was perfect at that hour. To get to the beach, you had to walk through a small section of woods. There was a trail in the middle that during the day was occupied by women jogging with strollers and kids running to another nearby beach. Our beach was more secluded and there was no trail to get there. The hill down was steep and slippery, and on the way back, it took climbing on all fours to get to the top. We stayed at that beach until about 8:30, just sitting in the dark, relaxing. We were good kids and mostly just sat on a log chatting. It was one of those weird situations where suddenly you look around and you realize that it's gotten dark. I told Lily and Evan that we should probably get home. They agreed and we packed up our gear. This was the latest that we had stayed out at the beach, so to my overactive and scary movie-powered imagination, I was a little scared. We calmly and silently, for some reason, walked up the hill. I told them that it was pretty creepy here at night, and that Evan made it 10 times worse. He told us a story about these mountain men who had been around in the 60s and were basically these men who lived in the woods and were in some sort of a cult. He said that they had murdered people all over the area for their cult, and that some were still around. Internally, I was hysterical and terrified, but externally, I basically told Evan to shut up and to stop trying to scare us. As we started to cross the trail, Evan looked to our right for some reason. He stopped dead in his tracks and looked scared. Lily told him to stop being stupid, and the two of us started to climb the steepest part. This is the part of the hill where you have to climb on all fours. Evan grabbed us both by the arm very forcefully and made us look where he was looking. At first, I couldn't see anything and I just wanted to get home. But then, my eyes adjusted and I saw a large man, I'm assuming it was a man because of the shape, stumbling toward us pretty slowly. Who knows what his intentions were, but being kids, we freaked out and scrambled up the hill as fast as we could. We all turned around at some point and saw that the dude was running toward us while we climbed. He got pretty close to us until we finally got over the hill and sprinted across the road to the cabin. It sounds fairly innocent, but we all had a deep feeling of dread when we saw him on that trail. I didn't feel like he had good intentions. Once we got to the cabin, we threw our gear on the porch and ran to the front door, and it was locked. There was a secret knock that her family had that showed that the person at the door was a member of the family or a friend. It was a fairly complicated rhythm, and both Lily and Evan banged on the door to the family knock. I just looked around trying to see if the creep had followed us, but saw nothing. We were let in and in a panic told the adults about the whole story. They said it was probably just some guy who we probably made feel bad. We disagreed, but felt safe in the locked cabin with grown-ups. The cabin had a walkout basement, basically like a lower story, not a creepy basement. It had a door and windows, where Lily and I slept on bunk beds. We went down to get into pajamas. After about 5 minutes of calming down together, we heard the family knock. I thought it was Evan trying to come in from the stairway door, so I said, "Come in." No response. It happened again, but this time we realized where it was coming from. The window outside. Lily and I turned completely white and stared at each other with that horrible feeling of terror in your stomach. It happened again, but a little more frantically. We both ran to the stairway door and booked it up to the living room where Lily's family and Evan were. We told them all what we had heard through the panicked tears, and Evan went downstairs to listen. He said it was definitely the knock. While Lily's uncle, older brother, and older cousin all gathered flashlights to go look outside, we heard it again, but on the front door. Everyone looked at the door and huddled together. It happened once or twice more, and Lily's uncle finally decided to call the police. He said, "I'm not sure what their intentions are, but there is someone trying to get into my cabin." The knocking went on for another 2 minutes or so, and it finally stopped. 5 minutes after the call, the police showed up with a comforting, loud pounding and "police" yell through the door. To make sure, Lily's uncle looked outside a window and saw other police searching around for the creeper. The policeman asked us 3 kids what had happened in the woods, and we told him the whole thing. The police never found anyone, but those banging knocks on the door will stick with me forever. The policeman said that it was probably just some guy who was twisted and just wanted to freak some kids out. But what creeped me out the most was the fact that the person had memorized the complicated family knock. All 3 of us slept on the floor together. To the creepy man who really wanted into our cabin, let's not meet ever. So, this happened at Christmas a couple of years ago, when I was spending the holidays with my parents and little brother along with my cousins, aunts, and uncles. We live in a suburb in Ontario, but we were venturing out into the woods for Christmas, an idea that my parents had had for a while. They always loved the idea of being out in a hunting cabin during a Christmas with their families. I'm a 22-year-old female, but at the time, I was newly 18. And my little brother, Tom, was 11. We're really close and do everything together. We also had a dog, a German Shepherd called Trigger, who came along for the ride too. He's a real softie, but can be really overprotective, especially of my brother Tom. Anyway, we left from our house on Christmas Eve at about 2 p.m. and climbed into our dad's truck, filled with all of our stuff and presents for his extended family. Tom and I were really excited, winding each other up, and my parents were having a friendly conversation as we moved along the road. We arrived at the village near the cabins we were staying in and caught up with my dad's sister, Billy, along with her husband and 3 kids. They didn't converse for too long, but Billy was a bit unsure of where to go from the village to get to the cabins, so my dad helped her out by writing down the directions. We soon got back on our way and arrived at the cabins at around 4 p.m. There were a cluster of them sort of spaced out around the woods. Each family had a cabin each, and there was one where everyone could meet up at, with a pool table, a swimming pool, and all sorts of stuff. It was kind of a place we could all just chill together and enjoy each other's company. Anyway, the weather was already really cold when we arrived, and the snow was falling all around us. So as me and my brother unpacked our things into the cabin, and then we settled in for the night. My dad started a fire whilst my mum made our dinner. It was great. The Christmas decorations were already up, and we played a few board games as the night got darker. Dad, Tom, and I decided before coming out on this trip that we'd go hunting sometime, so we planned to go the next day. I'd been a few times with my dad, but this was Tom's first time. He was only there to watch us, though, as he was too young to shoot. It reached about 10 p.m., and my brother and I were getting a bit tired, so we decided to go to bed. My dad kept his rifles in a bag, which he kept under the bed I was sleeping on. He'd usually keep it in a locked box, but thought there was no point since we were going hunting the next morning. Tom and I were sharing a room at the end of the cabin, facing a flowing river. The view was beautiful. Tom and I fell asleep with our dog, Trigger, lying at the bottom of Tom's bed. Now, this is where things begin to get creepy. It was about 3 a.m. when I awoke to Trigger growling. I didn't find this particularly unusual, because my dad suffers from insomnia, so sometimes when he can't sleep, he sits in our sitting room at home and watches some TV. Like I said, Trigger is extremely overprotective and growls at any noise he hears. But that's when I noticed that there was no light coming from under my door. My dad never just sits in the dark. I whispered to Trigger, telling him to be quiet as Tom slept, but his growling soon turned to barking, which woke Tom up. He asked me what was going on, but I said Trigger must have heard some deer or something outside. After all, we were in the middle of the woods. Suddenly, our bedroom door swung open and the light switch was turned on. My eyes stung as I tried to focus on whoever it was at the door. It was my dad. "Were you two laughing just now?" he asked as I turned to look at Tom, his eyes wide and his face pale. "No," I replied, as he moved over towards our curtain, pulling it back as he looked out into the pitch black. "What are you looking at?" Tom asked as our dad closed the curtains again. "Nothing, just go back to sleep." I was kind of creeped out that my dad didn't say anything about what he was doing, but he turned our light off and we tried falling back asleep again. Of course, I couldn't. I was wide awake for the rest of the night, flinching at pretty much every noise. It was about 4:30 a.m. when I finally drifted off, but it must have been moments later. I heard strange crunching noises coming from outside our window. I was sure this wasn't some sort of animal. It sounded like footsteps. I had this overwhelming feeling of fear, and I pulled the covers over my face, sweat beginning to cover my forehead. I then heard a faint tapping on our window, which lasted for a good few minutes. I was so petrified I couldn't move. Trigger was awake by this point, as I saw his face turn towards the window, his ears pointed, and listening intently. The tapping started again, but louder this time, causing Trigger to bare his teeth. What happened next was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me.
"I know you're in there, little guy."
This deep and husky voice whispered as a horrible shiver went down my spine.
"Why don't you come out here and play with me?"
Initially, I was filled with rage. I thought that it was bound to be one of my cousins playing a stupid prank on us, so I leaned forward and peeked through a gap in the curtain, ready to give them hell for scaring the shit out of us. But standing there wasn't any of our cousins. It was a creepy old man who was around 60. His hair matted and his clothes looked dirty and ancient. He was stroking the window with his hands, breathing on it as he spoke. I went into protective mode. I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my dad's hunting rifle from under my bed and pulled the curtain back. "Get the hell out of here or I'll shoot!" I felt adrenaline rush through me as the creepy man's eyes widened and the most terrifying smile appeared across his face. Trigger began barking louder than I've ever heard him bark. My parents obviously heard the commotion and came running through to our room, turning the light on. My mom screamed as she saw the old man through the window, Trigger fiercely continuing to bark at the man. My dad yelled at the man, telling him that the police were on their way, but the man legged it back into the woods. Tom was petrified, but I was angry more than anything else. How could some sicko do this? I was just extremely glad I had the rifle. The cops caught the guy just a few minutes later and arrested him. I found out a couple of days later that the creepy man was homeless and living in the woods, and he was suffering from a lot of mental issues. It scares me to death to think about what could have happened to my brother if I hadn't been there. We spent the remainder of Christmas Day at the cabin, but we stayed in our Aunt Billy's cabin overnight. There was no way we were sleeping in our own after what had happened. We went home first thing on Boxing Day and never looked back. My dad only told me the other day that he knew someone was hanging around our cabin, so he initially left the rifle under my bed in case I had to use it in self-defense. He did that because he didn't want to scare any of us. He called the cops after he heard the guy laughing outside of his bedroom window, singing nursery rhymes. He knew it would take a while for the cops to reach the cabin. Safe to say, that was the scariest experience of my life. So creepy old guy in the middle of the woods, please, let's not meet again. I was 11 when this happened. Ariel, my older sister, was 14, and Belle, my younger sister, was 8. My dad was a freelance programmer when I was younger. He made great money on his jobs, but because he was so heavily in debt, and my mom was not the most gifted person on balancing a budget, we never had much free money available. This meant that we went on vacation once every few years, and usually that was to a relative's house. My dad had just finished a long project for a big client, and we were celebrating the occasion with a new movie, Final Destination, because my dad loved watching scary stuff and scaring the daylights out of my sisters and me. We were in the middle of the movie when the phone rang. He went to get it and came back to grab my mom while we kept watching the movie. Belle took the opportunity to pause the film and take Duchess, our dog, captive because she was scared. They came back about 10 minutes later and announced that we were going to be spending the weekend in a cabin. We didn't know what to make of that, but apparently the client he'd been helping owned a nice cabin by a lake in the mountains and offered to let us lodge there this weekend for a considerably reduced price. It was Thursday, so my mom went into a panicked frenzy over packing, so we didn't see the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we packed up the family van and headed to the mountains. It was a 2.5-hour drive, so it was late by the time we got there. We unloaded the van and went exploring in the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a little nook thing you could climb up to that was about head height. It was about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storage, but it was an excellent place for 3 of us to hang in and play games. There were a few dozen board games up there, so we started playing once we decided on our rooms. Mom and Dad got the largest one. Ariel claimed the smaller one with a twin bed, so Belle and I got the last room, which had a queen-size bed we could share. We had a window on the right side of the bed, without a curtain, and a lamp on the left side of the bed. It was the only light source in the room, and there was a closet opposite the bed. It was locked, and we couldn't get in it. I never did figure out what was inside there. We went to bed at around 11. Belle is a kicker, so I slept by the lamp in case she ended up knocking it over. I remember lying down, and I must have instantly fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Belle was gripping my arm and trying to burrow under me. She was squeaking something in fright, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I sat up, looked towards her, and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took several moments to process that, and then I was shooting out of bed and dragging Belle with me. We rushed to our parents, who told us we were imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed and if we saw anything else to let them know. I, much to my current annoyance, agreed with them and went back in the room with Belle. We switched positions because she refused to go back to bed by the window. I told her a story to get her asleep and promptly conked out after her. I didn't wake up until morning. The next day we went exploring around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we'd spend the day in the town. They had a lot of small shops and my parents went into every one of them. We ate lunch and dinner in the town and finally went back to the cabin. Ariel made a joke about something as we neared the cabin, and I remember everybody laughing before my dad suddenly held up his hand to make everyone stop. He took another step towards the cabin and pushed the door open with a single finger. I thought it was strange that the door wasn't latched, but didn't put the obvious together right away. "Dad?" Ariel shuffled nearer to Belle and me, but Dad gave his head a shake to let her know she needed to be quiet. He went into the cabin and disappeared inside for a minute or two while we stood on the porch. Mom called out his name, and he called back that we could come inside. We did and found him standing in the middle of the living room with a frown. He locked the door once we were inside and took my mom to the bedroom for a quick chat. Ariel, having caught on to what was happening, opted to distract Belle and me by suggesting another round of the board game we'd been playing the night before. We hadn't been playing for more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad came back. Mom went about cleaning the dishes from breakfast while Dad joined our game. We played for a few hours before Dad told us we needed to go to bed. It was only 9 at that point, which made Ariel mad. She was allowed to stay up until 10:30 on school nights, and later on weeknights. Belle and I went on to bed while they argued. We climbed back into the same spots we slept in, Belle by the window and me by the lamp. I read to Belle for a bit before we drifted off. I woke to Dad rushing into our room. He scooped Belle out of the bed and grabbed my hand. He dragged me out of the room and into the hall, where I saw Ariel getting similar treatment by Mom. I became aware of a high-pitched whine in the living room and saw our dog sitting at attention by the back door. She was bristled and seemed anxious. Dad didn't put Belle down and didn't let go of my hand. They rushed out of the house and into the van. Dad went back to get our dog, and then he burned rubber getting out of the cabin. He drove all the way back home without talking once. It took a half hour for Duchess to calm down. He told Ariel what happened the next day, but Belle and I didn't find out until years later. He'd woken up that night to what sounded like moaning outside the window in his room. He jumped up and looked to see what was going on, and had found the front door unlocked. Stuff in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess started to growl at the back door, which was ajar. He locked it and got us out of the house. He went back the next day to get our luggage and found several pairs of footprints leading all the way around the cabin.